Merci. Monsieur le Président de la BCE, depuis le 4 novembre, vous êtes...
Thank you, President of the ECB. Since November, you've been the head of banking supervision in Europe with the SSM, and the most recent evaluation of the ECB on banking resistance has, according to you and your colleagues, been a success. But you're also the president of the steering committee of the ECB, looking at macroprudential conditions and the Eurozone. So you have a number of different hats, and therefore you have a considerable important role in the Eurozone. We have heard that there have been huge dangers identified by yourselves in the area of shadow banking and the subprime crisis which exploded a few years ago. Could you tell us why you have changed your policy on the high risk of shadow banking, which all of a sudden doesn't seem to be such a major threat, and why are you saying that securitization is one of the keys of your policy going forward? I'd also like to know about financial stability and the publication by the FSB of the annual list of the 30 large banks. Some of them are French, which are allegedly undercapitalized and therefore would not be able to survive the next financial crisis if there were one. I wonder whether in the ESRB you will apply to Cyprus the resolution mechanism that you've outlined, and wonder what will happen to the European citizens' bank deposits on these bank accounts, and what will happen in terms of the capital held by their banks. I wonder about solvency and the demands of the ESB in terms of capital reserves and the own resources of these mega banks, which are supposed to have at least 20% of their capital held in assets in order to avoid buy-ins. How are you going to ensure that they build up their capital to this level? I feel that an accommodating policy towards the private sector banking is detrimental to social democracy, and I feel that the European peoples are caught between Scylla and Charybdis, and the labour market is paying the price for it. Thank you.
Speaker Orkmark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Sometimes when one listens to these discussions, you can get the feeling that the best thing would be that we had no banks at all, because then we would have no risks in the banking sector. But if we are to have banks, it would be interesting to hear from you how we are to interpret the experience we have had and also the stress test regarding, would you say it would be better, we would be better off if we had more but smaller banks, smaller and more banks, or if we had, because that comparison is very often done, like in US, less of banking, less of financing via banks and more via the less regulated and supervised parts of the financial sector. I can imagine that one can hear that I'm aiming for something in this question, but I still is very curious about your answers.
Thank you. On the first question, if we look at what has happened in the banking sector in the course of the last, I would say, 7 years since the beginning, since the onset of the crisis in the end of 2007, we see that many things have changed. Regulation has been completely redesigned. Much of this redesign has been implemented. Much also is still to be implemented, but the line of direction is now clear. The banking system is nowadays more resilient, certainly, than it was before. The last example is the TLAC that I mentioned before. Also, risk management practices and incentives have changed profoundly in the banking industry. So I would say that to say that nothing has been done would be an exaggeration. At the same time, I agree with you, we shouldn't be complacent about what we are doing, and we should continuously monitor and be vigilant about developments, because the financial services industry is everything but a static industry. And it's in this sense that now the attention is focused on the non-banking or shadow banking sector. The stress tests have provided a very powerful indication about the state of health of the banking sector in the euro area, and also have provided for the first time a lot of better, I would say, harmonization of definitions, like, for example, the non-performing loans definition. We certainly have to improve our practices in making measures of capital more comparable, and I mentioned 3 areas of work before. The first is the valuation of goodwill. The second is the valuation of deferred tax assets. And the third, most important, is the risk-weighted assets definition, and therefore the analysis of internal rating models by the banks, especially the largest banks. This answers partly to your point about the French banks. French banks have not come out as undercapitalized, by the way, according to the AQR and the stress test performed according to the existing rules. So this is just the beginning of a long journey towards really having not only one supervisor but also one practice of supervision all throughout the area. On the last point was made about small versus large banks. It's a very, very difficult question. It's quite clear that if the bank is very small, the systemic implications are probably going to be smaller than having a very large bank failing. At the same time, it is shown that up to a certain size, there are economies of scale and economies of scope up to a certain point, which would produce better financing conditions for the real economy, both price-wise, quantity-wise, technical assistance-wise, and so on. After a certain point, however, complexity takes the dominance and makes the whole thing not only very difficult to manage, but also systemically much riskier. So it's very hard. And partly the answer depends also whom you ask to. If you ask the typical SMEs, they like small banks. They like small banks because they are closer to the client, they are closer to the land where they work, but also because there is a sort of relative power size dialogue there that takes place. While in the case of a very large bank, often the SMEs feels like a small man in a big universe. At the same time, very large banks often offer a variety of services which sometimes can be useful. So the other aspect that we have to consider, however, and this, by the way, your question impinges on what I was asked before, whether the euro area banking system is overbanked or not. It's partly the same question. The other point that needs to be addressed is the cost of having a banking system which is formed predominantly by small banks. If we look at certain countries have several hundreds of small banks, each one of these banks has a board. The board is formed by between, say, 5 and 19 people, and often the boards are highly politicized. The board member salaries are everything but small. Very often they range up to 100,000 and plus, 100,000 euros and plus. So these are all costs that in the end are paid by the client. So it's a very complicated question and it's one of the questions the SRB is looking at, by the way. Thank you.
Thank you very much to President Draghi. We look forward to the result of your work on liquidity shocks and also on your report on regulatory treatment of sovereign exposure, which you anticipated some elements with, which are very sensitive, of course. The date of the next hearing on the SRB chair will be communicated to members, will be in 2015. Thank you again to President Draghi.